Now I want to present two quick clips from the last 20 minutes of the film that show the beginning of the transformation of this racial epithet that becomes Moss's cure, and which exemplify Robson's contradictory representations of the origins of the black soldier's disease. The first of these shows Moss and his white friend Finch in a quick argument. And the second, which takes place about a half a day later in the plot and 10 minutes later in the film, shows Moss in despair as he waits for Finch to escape his capture and torture by the Japanese.
Shut up! What did I say? Shut up! Come on, you'll get us both killed, you bitch! I'm not asking you to say you yell at me.
You're going to note an expressive match between his face here and in the next clip. Sorry, it's a bit dark. As you can see, the epithet, which Finch does not quite complete, returns in a violent outburst by and against the black soldier himself. What can we conclude from Robson's representation of Moss, taking on and acting out the violence of this word? And why does he do it here and now when he is alone and waiting for the injured and injurious friend? In the diegesis, Moss's outburst seems to be an expression of self-hatred, of classic Fanonian internalized racism, and a desire to punish himself for what he perceives as his culpability in his friend's capture. At least this is how Robson has Moss interpret the incident to his doctor, who ignores it altogether. But despite the doctor's dismissive attitude, it is this epithet he must repeat to effect the cure. Further, the persistent return of the word, as injury, as identity, and as supposed treatment across the film demonstrates the centrality, not the irrelevance, of racial violence to Robson's project of representation. By tying this word and cinematic moment to both Moss's paralysis and his cure, Robson in fact designates as racial the bracketing off of the sick soldier from the other troops and from any kind of generalized war trauma. He shows Moss reproducing for the camera the off-screen nationalist attack on his white counterpart Finch and reconfiguring it into a racial one, which is not a far stretch given that war, particularly the US war against Japan, so often relies upon race. Most significantly, Robson shows viewers that the horrors of war abroad for African Americans, who have already lived through racial warfare at home, is always already experienced through the trauma of racialized violence. Nonetheless, Home of the Brave presents an extended debate between the doctor and his patient over the importance of race. Despite the film's visual presentation of the black soldier's tortured face following each slur he recalls during treatment, and you saw it up there, the doctor argues that the black soldier's ambivalent feelings about Finch's shooting have nothing to do with the white soldier's racist outbursts, or any of the white soldier's racist outbursts across the film, but rather that, quote, deep down underneath, he was thinking, it wasn't me. I'm glad I'm alive. You've got to realize something, he tells his patient. You're the same as anybody else. You're no different, Peter. No different at all. It's that sensitivity. That's the disease you've got. It was there before anything happened on that island, the doctor insists. And as the film heads toward narrative resolution, the doctor's diagnosis that Moss's trauma lies not in the history and legacy of racism, but in the far more recent present of shell shock, comes to dominate and suppress Moss's belief. That said, Robson's representation of Moss affords the black soldier a powerful, if not entirely productive, mode of resistance to the oppressive demands of both the doctor and assimilation. To the doctor's insistent interpreting, Moss answers, but I'm colored, urging the doctor to see not only his visible difference from the other men, but to recognize the social and political disenfranchisement this difference signifies. And in the clip you're about to see, it is precisely the visual elements of the film that support Moss in his argument, as Robson crafts what I call a mise-en-scène of resistance that enables his victimized black soldier to filmically fight back against the doctors and psychoanalysis totalizing interpretations. So in the following clip, I will direct your attention not only to the mode of argumentation on the screen, but in particular, Robson's framing and Moss's body language. This clip's a teeny bit longer.
All right, Moss, walk. I said get up and walk.
Doc, you know I can't.
Yes, you can.
No.
Try.
I can't. Try. I can't.
Get up and walk.
Here comes the cure, everybody.
Moss, get up and walk. Dirty nigger, get up and walk. All right,
He was trained at the best psychoanalytic institute. As you just saw, very quickly Moss stops trying to argue with his doctor. Instead, he continues resisting bodily, acting out rather than speaking his refusal of the doctor's cure. Thus, though in this scene, Robson both seemingly allows the doctor to triumph and deprives Moss of the language and control over the narrative, I would argue that the director also empowers its black soldier through the mise-en-scène. Moss's gestures and his hysteria in and of themselves act out the character's resistance. Refusing to move, or ultimately even to look at the doctor at the beginning of this scene, Moss resists not only the doctor's request and interpretation, but also interpellation into the cinematic structure of shot-reverse shot, the look back at the doctor, that dominates classical Hollywood style and narrative coherence. When the black soldier finally does walk, responding with rage and determination to the doctor's epithet, he moves Lockheed and Frankenstein-like into the fixed frame of the camera, you can see here, until he fills it with a fuzzy, unfocused image. This is not just fuzzy because it's here on the screen. It's a fuzzy image, and it's a very weird shot for classical Hollywood flick. The image kind of explodes. Robson allows his image for a moment to destroy even the ability of the camera to accurately depict the action of the film. Unwilling to give Moss agency in the narrative, reducing the black soldier to the helpless recipient of racial epithets by even his own doctor, Robson tellingly offers Moss an alternative mode of resistance, comprised by the soldier's hysterical paralysis and his desperate, nonverbal attempts to retain it. In other words, just as the black soldier's body and psyche are disarticulated in his filmic representation, so the film itself splits, presenting a propaganda-driven plot at the level of the narrative and a mise-en-scène that at least partially undermines it. One interpretation of Moss's hysteria, that it shows Moss as weak, damaged, and delusional, seems supported by the final scenes of the film, in which the soldier is cured by the doctor and goes on to establish a friendship with a crippled white soldier from his unit, because, black man, crippled white soldier, pretty much equal. Such a reading draws on a long history of scholarship by important thinkers like Anne McClintock and David Eng on the feminization and disempowerment of men of color at moments of increased cross-racial encounter and attempted integration and assimilation. What I'm proposing here is that rather, Moss's hysteria serves as a protection and a form of resistance from having to fight from an oppressive and racistly administered integration, as well as while hysterical and amnesiac, he can't even remember the members of his otherwise white military unit, and as protection from the doctor's cure, a rewriting of his racial trauma into generalized shell shock. Indeed, scholarship on the history of hysteria in both psychiatric literature and art entertainment suggests that Moss's disease may have further significance, and that psychoanalytic theory may in fact be used productively to explain the effects of racism, rather than simply to erase them. Early writings on hysteria, particularly in the late 1800s, focused on women and men, though primarily women, like Moss, whose various and strange paralyses and fits had no apparent physical etiology, yet prevented them from carrying out their allotted social roles. This is a pretty typical picture of, I think, one of Charcot's patients. Unable to successfully treat their patients, doctors of the time believed that hysterical women were suffering from an elusive disease of the womb. Freud revolutionized the treatment of these hysterics by identifying at the heart of hysteria a primarily psychic rather than physical mechanism, and famously insisting that, quote, hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences. Feminist critics from Cixous to Elizabeth Bronfen have argued against Freud's diagnosis of hysteria, claiming that for Freud's turn-of-the-century female patients, hysteria functioned as a, quote, language that allowed the subject to voice both personal and cultural discontent in a sexist society. Their work helps us to see hysteria as both the diagnosis of containment that overwrites systemic female oppression with an essentially biological paradigm, and a practice of female resistance against masculinist domination. Curiously, Freud himself acknowledged the role of minority identity in mental illness, or in the diagnosis of mental illness, writing in a letter to Arnold Zweig in 1933 that the Jewish tradition of circumcision was one of the primary causes of castration anxiety, which he also believed was a frequent cause of hysteria. Though he doesn't make explicit in his letter the full import of his claim, Freud here offers a blueprint for a racialized anxiety disorder. According to his own logic, the diseases Freud identifies as castration anxiety and hysteria may well be caused as much by socio-political factors as by psychic ones. In other words, hysteria can develop both in response and in resistance to oppression. This is certainly Fanon's claim in Black Skin, White Mask, where he describes internalized racism as both the colonized subject's interjection of his oppressor's violence and the platform for his emerging resistance. That said, hysteria is a deeply disabling disease, one that both Eng and Boyarin have noted has been used repeatedly in literature and medicine to, quote, mark off as well as create powerless bodies, both female and male, defined against the universal white middle-class heterosexual normative male subject, end quote. With both legal and social integration underway in the States, Moss's hysteria can be read to function all at once as a sign of his oppression, an attempt at his resistance, and a representation of his social and political powerlessness. Put most simply then, Robson's Black hysteric is here at once an unassimilable subject and a symptom of the failures of post-war integration.